On March 14, 1849, the county courthouse in Loun County, Alabama, burned to the ground. Officials called it an accident, an overturned lamp, a tragedy of carelessness. But among the smoking rubble, investigators found something an overturned lamp couldn't explain. 3 sets of human remains in the basement, chained 2 iron rings, driven into the stone foundation. The chains were not old, the iron hadn't rusted. Whatever happened in that basement happened recently, and whoever ordered it wanted those people to suffer before they died. Every county record from 1847 to 1849 was destroyed, alongside them property deeds, marriage certificates, and most critically, the probate documents for the Sutton estate. Someone didn't just want to erase evidence. They wanted to erase the people who could have spoken it aloud. For over a century, descendants of Loun County families whispered about what really happened at Bell River Plantation, about the twin daughters of Colonel Nathaniel Sutton, about the enslaved man named Marcus, who somehow documented everything before he vanished into history. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from surviving letters, medical records from Mobile, and testimonies given to a northern abolitionist society sealed until 1963. The truth begins not with the fire, but with a funeral 2 years earlier, and with 2 women who had been carefully, methodically, destroyed by the man who claimed to love them most. Before we go further, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell. We excavate the darkest corners of American history that textbooks bury. Leave a comment telling us what state you're listening from. We love knowing where our audience finds these forgotten horrors. Now, back to Bell River. Loun County in 1847 was caught in Kingdom Country. Black earth had made white men wealthy and carved the landscape into fiefdoms of columned houses and fields, stretching to the horizon. The county seat of Hanville sat at the center of it all. Brick buildings, dirt streets, planters conducting business while their wives pretended not to know exactly where the family money came from. Bell River Plantation lay 8 miles south of Hanville, accessible only by a private road that wound through stands of water oak. Colonel Nathaniel Sutton had built the main house in 1828, 12 rooms, a separate kitchen building connected by a covered walkway, and a quarter mile behind the house, 24 slave cabins arranged in 2 precise rows close enough to summon quickly, far enough that the colonel didn't have to hear the sounds of the lives he owned. Sutton had served under Andrew Jackson in the Creek War and returned from that conflict with a belief that would consume the rest of his life, that human beings could be improved through careful breeding, the same way one improved livestock. His library held medical texts from Philadelphia, agricultural journals from Virginia, and personal correspondence with men at universities who shared his obsessions about racial hierarchy and biological destiny. He kept meticulous records, measurements, observations, genealogies traced back 3 generations. His neighbors called him eccentric but brilliant. The people he owned called him something else entirely, though never where white ears could hear. The colonel never married. In 1824, he purchased a woman named Ruth from a Charleston trader. The bill of sale described her as being of uncommonly fair complexion and gentle bearing, language that tells you everything about what was really being transacted. Ruth gave birth to twin daughters in 1825, Sarah and Catherine. The colonel raised them in the main house, educated them with tutors from Mobile, dressed them in silk ordered from New Orleans. He never freed them, never acknowledged them as his daughters in any legal document. On paper, they remained his property, an arrangement that gave him total authority over every dimension of their existence. This is important. Remember it. The twins grew up in a peculiar, suffocating isolation. They learned to read and write, to paint watercolors, to play pianoforte. They studied mathematics, geography, French, but they almost never left the plantation grounds. The colonel screened every social contact through his own rigid criteria. He told his daughters they were special, elevated above their station, but that the world beyond Bell River would never understand or accept them. He told them that safety came only through seclusion, that trust was weakness, that power, however constrained, was the only currency that mattered. The twins learned these lessons too well. They developed their own language, glances, gestures, finishing each other's sentences. They fell silent for days and communicated only through notes passed across the dinner table. They wore coordinating colors, Sarah in deep green, Catherine in midnight blue. They read the same book simultaneously, one starting at the front, one at the back, meeting in the middle. They shared everything: hairbrushes, jewelry, secrets, and eventually something darker. Their mother Ruth died in 1839, officially from pneumonia. The slave quarters whispered about bruises on her arms and a terror in her eyes. During her final weeks that had nothing to do with fever. After Ruth's death, the colonel's control over his daughters tightened like a noose pulled slow. He installed locks on their bedroom doors that could only be opened from the outside. He required weekly written reports on their activities, their thoughts, their dreams. He created elaborate tests, leaving valuables in plain sight, introducing male visitors to observe reactions, engineering situations designed to reveal any hidden rebellions. This was not parenting. This was the management of assets he had already decided were his to control indefinitely. By 1847, Bell River had grown into a productive horror. 63 enslaved people whose labor produced 142 bales of cotton annually. But what distinguished Bell River from other plantations wasn't just its output, it was its demographic profile. A disproportionate number of light-skinned individuals, more children than birth rate should have produced, and a disturbing pattern of families separated and sold away just as children reached adolescence. The overseer, Jonas Pritchett, kept his own parallel records, punishment logs, dietary restrictions for slaves the colonel had designated for his breeding program. These notebooks documented atrocities in the casual register of farming reports, which women were forced into which cabins, which pregnancies were terminated, by what methods, with what results. Somewhere between murder and management, filed under productivity. In the main house, Sarah and Catherine understood more than their father realized. They read his journals during his trips to Mobile. They pressed their ears against doors and gathered fragments. They knew what happened in the quarters after dark. They knew which enslaved people were their half-siblings. They knew their father viewed human beings as experimental subjects in his personal laboratory of racial theory, and they had been learning, for years, to hate him with a cold and patient fury that would have terrified him had he been capable of recognizing it in people he'd chosen not to see. The morning of February 3, 1847 arrived with unseasonable warmth. Colonel Sutton had spent the previous evening in his study, working by lamplight on correspondence with a professor at the Medical College of South Carolina. By 10 in the morning, Pritchett found him slumped in his leather chair, skin gray and waxy, long since cold. Dr. Amos Grayfield arrived from Hanville 2 hours later and barely glanced at the body before declaring the cause of death a hard seizure. The man was 56, worked himself to exhaustion. The heart gives out. Simple as that. But the details didn't hold together under any real scrutiny. The colonel's dinner tray sat barely touched. His coffee cup showed a peculiar residue, fine sediment that glittered faintly at the bottom. His final letter to his attorney in Mobile remained unfinished mid-sentence. I have made certain arrangements regarding the future of my daughters which must be executed precisely as stipulated for their own protection and for the preservation of my life's work. Should any person attempt to... The sentence ended there. The pen had trailed off the page as if his hand had suddenly lost all strength. In the hallway outside, Sarah and Catherine stood holding hands, fingers interlaced. They wore matching black mourning dresses they had somehow obtained with no advance warning of their father's death. Their faces showed no grief, no shock. They watched the proceedings with identical expressions of watchful, total calm. 2 years later, Marcus would document the truth that everyone in that hallway failed to see. Arsenic mixed with powdered glass, administered in small doses over 3 weeks to simulate heart failure. The twins had planned it with the same meticulous precision their father had taught them. He had spent decades teaching them that humans could be managed, controlled, and eliminated when they became obstacles. He had simply neglected to consider that he might one day become the obstacle. The will reading, conducted by the colonel's attorney Jeremiah Osgood, revealed the full scope of the trap Sutton had set even from beyond death. Bell River Plantation, all lands, structures, livestock equipment and human property went to Sarah and Catherine jointly, but the bequest was conditional. Both daughters must enter lawful Christian marriage with men of suitable character and standing, approved by the estate executors. Both marriages must produce legitimate offspring. Both conditions must be satisfied within 24 months of the colonel's death. Should either condition fail, Bell River would be sold at public auction, proceeds distributed to agricultural colleges, medical societies, and organizations dedicated to the advancement of the colonel's theories about racial hierarchy. Even dead, he was trying to breed them. There was also a private letter, 3 pages in the colonel's handwriting, delivered by Osgood with visible discomfort. The letter explained that he had observed his daughter's unnatural attachment to one another, their rejection of appropriate feminine interest in courtship and marriage. He had concluded they would never voluntarily separate or form alliances with men who could continue his work, so he had constructed a situation where they had no choice. The letter's final paragraph was the most chilling. I have made arrangements to ensure you choose wisely. My network of correspondence extends throughout the state and beyond. They will be watching, reporting back on your conduct. Remember always that you are what I made you, and you cannot escape the fundamental truth of your nature, no matter how you might pretend otherwise. The blood that flows through your veins is both your privilege and your prison. Sarah folded the letter back into its envelope. Her face revealed nothing. 24 months, Catherine said quietly. That gives us until February 1849. They were already calculating. Marcus arrived at Bell River in late April 1847, purchased at auction in Hanville for more than market value. He'd served the Granville family, Quakers, abolitionists, as a house servant and tutor to their children. He could read and write. He had, in the years before the Granvilles died, spent half a decade documenting plantation atrocities in coded shorthand, hiding his notebooks inside a hollowed-out Bible that no white person had thought to inspect. He expected to find monsters at Bell River. Instead, he found something harder to navigate. 2 women who had been made monstrous by a man who had convinced him it was the natural order. Sarah presented the arrangement to him directly, without pretense. They needed a man educated enough to maintain household accounts, discreet enough to participate in their scheme, and vulnerable enough that refusal was never a real option. They intended to find husbands they could control completely, men too desperate, too sick or too indebted to interfere in how Bell River actually operated. Those husbands would provide legal legitimacy. Marcus would provide the biological reality the will required. In exchange, documented freedom and enough money to reach Philadelphia. "You're asking me to commit an act that could get all of us killed," Marcus said. "No one will discover it," Catherine replied. "We control every variable, every witness, every piece of evidence." "I'm a slave," Marcus said. "There is no variable that protects me if this fails. You lose your reputation, I lose my life." "Which is why," Sarah said, "you'll be motivated to ensure it doesn't fail." He agreed. What he didn't say aloud was that Bell River represented something he hadn't anticipated. An archive. The Colonel's journals, his breeding logs, his decades of correspondence with other planters and academics. This was a documented record of systematic evil on a scale Marcus hadn't encountered before. If he could copy those records and get them north, the exposure wouldn't just destroy one dead man's legacy. It could indict an entire network. He agreed to their scheme, and quietly, methodically, he began building his own. What Marcus found in the Colonel's private papers was worse than he'd imagined. Not just the forced pairings, the children evaluated and sold, the families separated with clinical indifference. Buried in the medical notes was something more immediately horrifying. The Colonel had infected multiple women with syphilis, either through his own systematic sexual abuse or, the journals hinted at something more deliberate, as an experiment in disease transmission and treatment. By the summer of 1847, nearly a third of Bell River's enslaved population showed symptoms: lesions, fever, progressive deterioration. Marcus brought his findings to the twins, laying out the evidence with the Colonel's own annotations. "Your father gave him syphilis," he said. "It's spreading. It's killing them." Catherine's face went pale. Sarah stood abruptly, turning to the window. What followed surprised Marcus. Sarah ordered mercury treatments for every infected person, expensive, dangerous, and labor-reducing. She brought in a doctor over Pritchard's objections. She ordered improved rations for the sick. She absorbed the cost without apparent hesitation. "Our father did this," she said, when Pritchard questioned the expense. "We're correcting his damage." It was the first crack Marcus had seen in her composure. The first indication that something beneath the cold calculation was still human. He filed it away as intelligence. He wasn't yet sure what to do with it. By November, Sarah was pregnant. Catherine's marriage to Lawrence Kemper, a 51-year-old widower with consumption and a persistent death wish in the form of a suppressed cough, was arranged for January. Everything was proceeding according to the twins' precise design. Then, one night before Catherine's wedding, Marcus heard screaming. He rushed upstairs to find the twins in open physical combat. Catherine's nose was bleeding. Sarah had scratch marks torn down her cheek. Catherine was demanding they poison Lawrence before the ceremony. Why wait for his natural death when arsenic could be administered cleanly? Sarah was screaming back that they were not murderers. "Aren't we?" Catherine said. Then with a quiet that was somehow worse than the screaming. "Or had you forgotten the coffee you gave father the night he died?" The room went silent. Marcus stood in the doorway and understood, in that moment, the full geometry of what he'd walked into. These were not women trying to escape their father. These were women who had absorbed him so completely that his methods had become their instincts. Sarah recognized it. Catherine had stopped caring. "If you poisoned Lawrence," he said slowly, "everything ends. Every record I've been keeping, every document, every plan, it all burns when they investigate. And they will investigate." The argument dissolved, but not the tension underneath it. That night, Marcus wrote faster than he'd ever written before, compressing months of documentation onto the thinnest paper he could find. Preparing for a transfer north he needed to execute before the violence these women were capable of turned in an unpredictable direction. In May 1848, a traveling preacher named Jacob Sturgis arrived at Bell River collecting missionary donations. Over dinner he mentioned Philadelphia. He used a particular phrasing, a particular pause, that Marcus recognized from years spent in the Granville household, Underground Railroad. That evening, near the stable, Marcus pressed his copied documents into Sturgis's hands. 10 days later, a field worker named Isaiah confirmed delivery in Selma. The testimony was moving north. The evidence existed now beyond the twins' reach. Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. Not relief, but grief. Because the story he'd documented was not the clean moral narrative he'd planned to write. The Colonel's crimes were documented in exhaustive, damning detail. But so was everything else. The poisoning, the scheme, his own participation in it. The truth he'd sent north was complicated and ugly and didn't have heroes, only people making terrible choices under conditions designed to make every choice terrible. Lawrence Kemper died in August, quietly, from the disease that had been consuming him since before Catherine married him. He was buried with a simple headstone that said he found peace at the end, which was probably the most honest thing that had been written about anyone at Bell River in 20 years. In November, Thomas Breenage made a drunken comment at a card game about the suspicious timing of Sarah's pregnancy. The scandal spread fast. When the executors arrived demanding explanation, Sarah stood before them 7 months pregnant and delivered a calculated confession: premarital intimacy, shame, a decision to preserve the marriage rather than destroy it. She performed guilt with the precision of a woman who had been performing survival her entire life. The men believed her, because the alternative required them to consider a reality they were not equipped to examine. Both babies were born before the year's end. Sarah delivered first a girl she named Abigail. Catherine's labor was harder, the umbilical cord wrapped around the infant's neck, the midwife working with quiet efficiency until the weak cry confirmed survival. Catherine named her daughter Ruth, after the woman their father had purchased, used, and destroyed. The names were the first decisions either of them had made that weren't calculated for advantage. They were simply mothers naming their daughters after women who'd been erased. The estate transferred formally on December 20th. Harold Breenidge examined both infants, pronounced the conditions satisfied, and left. Bell River was theirs. Papers in April 1849. That gold Sarah pressed into his hands was more than they'd agreed. He held his daughters one final time before he left, memorizing their faces, the weight of them, the specific smell of their hair. He carried a daguerreotype commissioned secretly by Sarah, himself holding both girls. Marcus and his daughters, April 1849. May they all find freedom. He never returned to Alabama, but his testimony did publish that July by the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, naming Colonel Nathaniel Sutton specifically, detailing the breeding programs, the syphilis, the network of collaborators in academic and medical institutions who'd called themselves scientists while they committed atrocities. In Alabama, the fury was immediate. By September, Harold Breenidge arrived at Bell River with a warrant and a sheriff. Sarah produced Marcus's manumission papers and answered every question in the same measured, perfectly modulated voice. Her father had spent 20 years trying to silence. They found nothing. Catherine had burned it all weeks before. 6 weeks later, Bell River was sold. Several enslaved people were manumitted with funds. The remainder was sold to a Quaker merchant who'd made quiet arrangements for transport north. Thomas Breenidge took his settlement and disappeared. On October 15, 1849, a fire consumed the Loun County Courthouse. The investigation concluded it was accidental. An overturned lamp and the bodies in the basement were identified as vagrants. No one looked at the chains in the foundation too closely. No one wanted. Their daughters grew up knowing only that their mothers had come from Alabama, that they had escaped, and that their father had been a good man who made sacrifices and told the truth when silence would have been safer. In 1863, the documents were entered into the Congressional Record as evidence for why slavery required not reform but total abolition. Colonel Nathaniel Sutton's legacy became exactly what his daughters had promised it would be: exposure, condemnation, and proof that the systematic evil of slavery was not an accident of cruelty but a deliberate architecture of control, built and maintained by men who wrote it all down. Marcus died in Philadelphia in 1891. His Bible was discovered during an estate sale in 1963, the hollowed interior still containing the original coded notebooks that had started everything. The abolitionist society that purchased them kept them sealed for 2 years while historians argued about their authenticity, that no verifiable record survived, that the Courthouse Fire consumed too much, that the twins' false identities were too thorough, that we can't prove any of it to the standard required by serious scholarship. But here's what we know. The bones were real. The chains were real. The chains were real. The system that made all of this not only possible but almost predictable was real. Whether Sarah and Catherine Sutton stood on a dock in Mobile Harbor on October 14, 1849 and watched the Alabama coastline disappear without looking back, that we cannot prove. We know how violence teaches itself forward through generations, wearing new faces and using different words. The fire at Bell River burned the cotton and the records in the plantation house and most of the evidence of what happened there. Bible, some things survive even the most deliberate destruction. What do you think happened to the 3 people chained in that courthouse basement? Who were they and who put them there? Leave your theory in the comments below. If this episode stayed with you, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who needs to know the history the textbooks erased. The next story goes somewhere even darker than this one. We'll see you there.